Welcome to our Sustainability Action Society podcast, titled The Energy Transition of Today and What is Expected in the Next Few Years. And with me today to deconstruct this wonderful conversation, I have Jeffrey Beyer, who is the Managing Director of Zest Associates. Jeffrey has authored a lot of landmark studies on financing the green transition, and together with specializing programs and initiatives on low carbon technologies. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
Jeffrey, I start off by saying, we both know that the success of the energy transition really depends on the transformation of the global energy sector to move away from fossil fuel-based supply to zero carbon sources, if we are going to actually limit and meet the 1.5 degrees trajectory. Now, you and I, we both attended the World Future Energy Summit, which was early January, which was the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week. And at the same time, they had the IRENA Assembly. And during the IRENA Assembly, we heard that there was a global energy transition stocktake. And I mean, when we delve deep into this question is for our audience, where are we in the world on energy transition today?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on this really important podcast. I think this is a real transition moment, actually. I think we're at the takeoff point, really, for renewables and for the global consciousness understanding the importance of energy transition. I think that also marries with a really competitive cost story. So we've seen the cost of solar power fall by 92% since 2010. Wind power has fallen, 60% or more. Before where there was a real tension between the cost of renewables and that transition, I think that tension has largely dissipated. Mm-hmm. 2022 was a record year for wind and solar, but also for coal and oil. So we saw more coal burned, more oil pumped in 2022, but we also saw this huge increase of wind and solar power more than ever before. So really what that shows, I think, for us is this kind of insatiable appetite for energy that we have around the world, with so many countries moving towards emerging economies, industrializing, and so on. There's this growing appetite. But in terms of the transition story, the world is set to add as much renewable power in the next 5 years as it did in the past 20 years. Okay. So by 2028, we'll have built the equivalent of what we did since the millennium. And, renewables are set to account for over 90% of global electricity expansion over the next 5 years. So we're really looking at this transition starting to take off and that kind of exponential curve really starting to bite.
So we definitely see momentum, and I think momentum is going to propel much further in the next 5 to 10 years. We know the region is really a powerhouse of energy sources, having a rich hydrocarbon portfolio, but at the same time having a rich renewable potential within the region. How do we get from where we are today to a world of tomorrow? But at the same time, we're so anxiously trying to meet these commitments of around climate mitigation and energy transition. What is needed for the future? What would the energy strategies, energy mix of the future actually look like?
Yeah, I think, well, for the region, there's things that need to happen in sequence, kind of. And I think the first thing that needs to happen and that the countries are prepared for is this massive build out of renewables. Mm-hmm. We've seen huge targets in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, across the region. So there's a real appetite for new renewable power. There's a point at which renewables are more difficult to integrate into the grid, right? So it becomes more difficult to operate a grid effectively with a really high penetration of renewables. To manage that, we can really build out interconnections. So connect not only regionally, but also interregionally to transmit energy from places where it's abundant to places where it's not. That's especially relevant east-west when you think of solar power because of the way the sun rises. I think ultimately we need to future-proof the grid and then figure out what we do with the existing generation capacity that is fossil fuel powered, right? There's a lot of gas-powered generation in the region. And that's incompatible in many ways with a net zero future. So how do you retrofit those potentially using carbon capture, utilization, and storage? or figuring out how to decommission those assets in a way that's affordable.
So, I mean, if I look at it, yes, we all agree that we need to have a diversified energy mix, which would include, as you said, still the hydrocarbons, which probably will encapsulate the CCUS, hydrogen that comes into play, renewables obviously taking the precedence of the percentage of the energy mix. And a lot of the energy transition discussions, even today, is a lot on the focus of renewables. What are some of those, if we talk about the ideal energy mix, what are some of the barriers that kind of prevent us from scalability and accelerating the implementation to meet climate commitments?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are kind of 4 or 5 key barriers, and it depends on your country, but some of these really matter. In Europe, in particular, I think, and also in the US, actually, permitting is a real barrier to growing. Yes. So this used to be a very wonkish kind of topic, like streamlining permits, but genuinely, this is one of the things that's holding up rapid deployment of solar and wind. I think energy storage is another big technical issue that we need to manage. Obviously, the sun shines during the day. Storing some of that capacity at night is critical for it to be deployed. Again, interconnection is another barrier that's surmountable, but still there. And I think actually one of the biggest barriers that we're going to face in this energy transition is accepting the fact that some fossil fuels need to stay in the ground, right? I think every country wants to be a producer of last resort. But when you look at the numbers, I think our carbon budget, if you're familiar with that term, the listeners, then we have about 400 to 500 billion tons of carbon to be emitted into the atmosphere before we breach 1.5 degrees. The proven reserves are about 10 times that, or 8 times that. So about 3.5 trillion tons of proven reserves. So it's very difficult to understand how we're going to square that circle with company valuations based on their proven reserves. And if 80% of those can't be used, how do we manage that transition? I think that's a really challenging question to unpick.
So I think as you've highlighted, there are obviously a lot of challenges to kind of promote scalability, but obviously, we know that the energy mix of the future includes all of these kind of solutions. Specifically touching on hydrogen, it's kind of the new buzzword of the I won't say decade, but the new buzzwords in the last maybe 3 to 5 years, especially around green hydrogen. And touching on that conversation a bit, we know that there's solutions of CCUS that can help, the hydrocarbons potential to be captured on the carbon content. Hydrogen can be introduced as an alternative. Yes, of course, renewables a big player with battery energy storage. But how do you see hydrogen being a key player? You've authored a lot of the papers with the UK and UAE on the hydrogen supply. How do you see hydrogen being part of that energy mix regionally? We've seen a lot of UAE announcement. Hydrogen will be a big exporter for the UAE, especially to niche markets of Europe, US, etc. But how do you see hydrogen playing the role regionally here within the energy mix?
Yeah, hydrogen's a very interesting story and one where there's a lot of debate and disagreement but also like a lot of enthusiasm from around the world, in particular in this region. And that's for a few reasons. I think the region is really, really well placed to be a major hydrogen producer. It has abundant, cheap, renewable power. It has the right proximity to demand markets, has stable governments, a good financial system, and so on. So there's lots of good reasons for hydrogen to play a big role here. I think in terms of domestic use, this is one of the key enablers to, I think, unlock an international trade market. When we talk about international trade, we're talking about gigawatts of production, hundreds of thousands of kilograms, it's a lot of hydrogen. And how do you get that started? And I think that there's a realistic opportunity to tackle local demand opportunities first in order to create that capacity that's then big enough for to justify exports. What I mean by that is looking at first of all industrial decarbonization. So green steel using hydrogen is a real opportunity here. I think looking at heavy transport, so long distance trucking and rail, also shipping. These are opportunities that take and require smaller volumes of hydrogen, but can create that domestic demand that gives investors confidence to unlock funding to invest in these projects, creates a bankable kind of chain, and proves certain technologies at the small then medium scale, with a view to very large scale deployment.
So I like what you've just actually mentioned. So being a global hub for export in terms of production, it can be produced at a low cost for the export market, but then tap into the domestic need to decarbonize, especially on an industrial manufacturing perspective.
Exactly right. And I think also the region's heavy involvement in the petrochemicals industry, that's where most hydrogen is used today.
Yeah.
So decarbonizing chemicals is a real opportunity. And I think in particular with forthcoming legislation or existing legislation in the EU, looking at the carbon content of imports and carbon border adjustments, chemical companies that have a lower carbon footprint per unit of chemicals will have an advantage in terms of imports and exports to Europe and other jurisdictions with that kind of legislation.
I touch on a little bit on CCUS. In retrospect here, Saudi Arabia has come out very boldly with their carbon circular economy approach to kind of decarbonize the whole oil and gas industry. To be able to supply, the energy mix of the future. What are your thoughts on the whole carbon circular economy that have been announced by Saudi Arabia, and how is it going to be positioned as the decarbonized solution for the future?
Yeah, I think the circular carbon economy is a very interesting, framework for how to consider future decarbonization. I know a lot of work has been done on this, led by Mary Lualmi at CAPSARC, King Abdullah's Petroleum and Research Center in Saudi Arabia. They've developed a circular carbon economy index. And for those who aren't familiar with the term, it kind of takes the 3 R's you think about, like reduce, reuse, and recycle, but adds remove as well. So this all has to do with reducing carbon emissions through energy efficiency, renewables, and nuclear. Reusing carbon through carbon capture and use, recycling carbon through bioenergy and fuel switching, including bioenergy, and then removing carbon through nature-based solutions, reforestation, carbon capture and storage, and kind of direct air capture or other carbon dioxide removal technologies. So I think the circular carbon economy, it lets countries who historically have felt excluded from a sustainability conversation or a low carbon conversation like Saudi Arabia to participate, because they can see their abundance of resources, their fossil fuel resources, still playing a role in a sustainable transition if the emissions from those fossil fuels are otherwise compensated for through reductions, reuse, and removal. It's criticized as potentially being a greenwashing type approach, but there's some real rigor developed behind this concept from smart people who care about the climate, and I think that it does have a real place in the conversation, in particular for oil and gas producing countries that are otherwise struggling to figure out how they can participate in this decarbonization journey. And that goes beyond we're talking Canada, Norway, the United States. It's not just a Gulf thing. There's many countries around the world that have this challenge.
Absolutely. And, touching on that, we see that energy supply needs to be decarbonized. And I think this is on the radar for all countries and all governments, especially as we head up to COP28. This will be, climate mitigation, climate adaptation is a conversation that will be of focus. But equally in this equation of climate mitigation and energy transition is demand side management, which is the energy efficiency. Because at the end of the day, if you don't balance the both, you're still going to have a high consumer demand, equating with a high energy supply. So it equally has to be balanced.
Yeah.
So on the demand side we see a lot of the public and private sectors coming on board. driving energy efficiency, reducing energy consumption, etc. How do you see this balancing model regionally to help the energy transition?
Yeah, I mean, energy efficiency is such a key component of decarbonization, and something that has been systematically ignored since I've started working in this field like 18 years ago. So I love energy efficiency. I think it's so useful, interesting. Not many people agree that it's interesting. I think most people think it's really
super
boring.
important.
Super important, right? Energy efficiency is called the first fuel, right?
Yes.
It's the thing. Every megawatt saved is called a negawatt, and like a negative watt. And anyway, I think energy efficiency is absolutely central to the decarbonization story. Last year, there was an initiative called Mission Efficiency that was launched. And it's really done some deep thinking into this issue, and has come out with kind of 3 areas of need to accelerate this efficiency story. The first one is elevate, which kind of means elevate the issue personally in organizations so that there's a clear narrative that supports progress and convenes partners. The second one is support. So this is kind of delivering strategic and technical support by partners to really increase deployment. And the third thing is invest. So, actually invest money into efficiency, and the returns are generally extremely high, right? But often need to overcome a number of barriers. I've done a couple of really interesting pieces of work here, helped to establish an industrial energy efficiency program in South Africa, which really included a lot of education and awareness raising, but also training of people who could assess and implement energy efficiency solutions. The other one is looking at energy service companies, or ESCOs.
ESCOs, yes.
Absolutely elegant model to reduce energy. And it calls for, in my opinion, the intervention of government to support ESCO markets and to really facilitate those through the establishment of a super ESCO, like a facilitating entity to coordinate the market, take away risk, build the understanding of how ESCOs work, provide guarantees and insurance, standardization of contracts. These are all things that might challenge the energy efficiency market. And I think there's a real role for government to play to facilitate a private sector in this space.
So building on that question,
yeah.
I mentioned that it needs to be a balancing equation from energy supply to demand side management or energy efficiency. So would you agree with me, or maybe if you can add your comments on, does the whole decarbonization journey require the decentralization elements to support, be it climate commitments that we align to both from a private and public sector, but especially in the Middle East? We know that we're challenged by the lack of regulation on decentralization. So how do you see that playing a major role? And you touched a little bit on private sector working with governments around that. So if as an organization, you want to drive energy efficiency, reduce your consumption patterns, drive the super ESCO models that we kind of aligning to. How does the decentralization help this whole equation?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. The more empowered individual actors are to take climate action, the faster it's going to happen. I think there are some legislative barriers here in Dubai around self-production for renewable energy that you may want to strap onto your building or build a plant that can supply your own energy. So I think there are some regulatory challenges that need to be unstuck. I think with some legislative changes, it unlocks a huge amount of decentralized action and opportunity. And that's where that kind of interface between the public and the private sector is so critical, so that the private sector can explain what and how things can change to create that decentralized action.
So I think, if I hear in between the lines, there's a lot of up and coming, kind of changes, especially as we head up to COP28. But equally important, if we're talking about just energy transition of today and of tomorrow, it is a conversation that needs to be a collaborative dialogue between both government, public, and the private sector, especially around supply, demand, and solutions on the low carbon solutions to solve this whole kind of energy transition and energy mix of the future. Our sessions has really been insightful. We're mindful of the time, but I have one last question.
Sure.
And reeling on the momentum of COP28 that's coming in November, a lot of the discussion is on climate mitigation, climate adaptation. What do you think would be a key focus for COP28 agenda for changes to happen and for us to accelerate the action that is needed literally in the next 2 to maybe 5 years?
Yeah, I think that one of the key things that needs to happen at COP28 is commitments to genuinely invest in and build in these technologies that are proven and inexpensive at this point. So we need, I think, a facility perhaps to rapidly deploy the abundant capital that exists around the world, really move that into renewables and energy efficiency, in particular in emerging markets. And I think that there's a huge risk premium put on investment in emerging markets, but we'd be fools to invest in traditional fossil fuel technology today that's going to have a 40 or 50 year lifetime. We really need to support emerging markets to leapfrog right towards a low carbon growth story. That's critical. I think there's an innovation angle for the UAE, in particular around its areas of competitive advantage. So hydrogen is one, carbon capture and storage. Another, sustainable aviation fuels, I think carbon dioxide removal technologies. These are kind of heavy industrial things that matter. I think there's another real opportunity for collaboration around desalination and around arid agriculture and cooling. So like air conditioning, huge opportunities, huge needs for security, food security, energy security, comfort. These are things that are absolutely critical, especially for this region, and that's where I think this region can really lead.